happy to introduce this morning's panel of Karen Compton, Kendall Nicholson, and Andrew Chin. Karen Compton is principal of A3K Consulting, LLC, a business development and strategic planning firm that specializes in the AEC industry. Ms. Compton has more than 20 years experience in the optimization of organizations through business planning, strategic planning, and corporate social responsibility. Following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, Ms. Compton and Gabriella Bullock, FAIA, joined forces to executive produce a bi-monthly video podcast entitled Breaking the Silence of Design that explores the issues of race, equity, and inclusion in the profession. Provided as a resource through several AIA components, the podcast has become a safe space for hard discussions and move toward inclusion. In addition to a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry from Mount St. Mary University, Ms. Compton has a certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University and has served as a regent for Mount St. Mary's University and as a member of the board of directors for a national engineering firm. I'd like to ask, applause from Ms. Compton. I'd like to ask Arthur Sheffield, Associate AIA, to introduce our next panelist.
Dr. Kendall A. Nicholson is a licensed educator, trained architectural designer, and an avid researcher. A native of Prince George, Virginia, his interest in architecture started in middle and high school with a local and regional involvement with the Technology Student Association. Dr. Nicholson received his BS in architecture from the University of Virginia in 2009, where he was the first ever graduate of the program in 3 years. He later obtained a master's in real estate from Georgetown University in 2010 and a Doctor of Education from Regent University in 2014. He is currently the Director of Research and Information for the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Andrew Chin is the Associate Director at Florida A&M University School of Architecture, Engineering, and Technology. Professor Chin is a tenured associate professor who has taught at FAMU since 1991 and previously served as the interim dean, assistant dean, and director of the architecture programs. Chin teaches thesis research and urban design classes, and it's part of my alma mater at Florida A&M. And on stage with us is Regine Swanson. She is a Florida A&M student, graduate student, currently doing her studies at Florida A&M and has worked at Robert Stern Associates in the past. So welcome, Regine. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. And just as you know, there's no other microphones. So at the end, if there's questions, I will try to shout out those questions to the panelists, just so you know, I don't have an actual microphone to give you.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. We've spent a lot of time together in preparation for this conversation, and that's exactly what it is. It's a conversation. And so I have a series of questions that I would like to ask our esteemed panel, and then give an opportunity for those of you in the audience to offer your questions and thoughts as well. So with that, I want to begin my first question to you, Ken. In your research, you've published a series called Where Are My People? And it is a wonderful series that addresses within historical context why Black students in particular are less likely to consider a career in architecture. Can you share from a framework perspective that as a starting point for this discussion?
Thanks for that question, and thanks everyone for being here to see and participate in the dialogue that we'll have today. I think it's important to think about, when I research and talk about equity, I'm usually looking at history and systems. And so in a context of Black and Blackness, the history is one of enslavement, it's one of disenfranchisement, it's one of strength and perseverance. But it's important that we consider that full context, even though some of it is outside of the discipline of architecture. So I look at underlying root causes, like the prison industrial complex, like lack of opportunities and access to, in this case, architecture specifically. And if we consider that, like I like to use the statistic that in America, 1 out of every 33 Black men over the age of 18 is or has been incarcerated. If you take that same statistic for whites, it's one, and this is black men, I hope I said that, but if you take that same statistic for white men, it's 1 out of every 251. And so to think that the paucity of black men in architecture, again, I'm being specific about the demographic I'm talking about, but black men in architecture is in no way related to the prison industrial complex. You'd have a lot of things that you'd have to reconcile. You'd have to fundamentally believe that black men in this case are just naturally more criminalistic, which if that's what you believe, we can have a conversation afterwards. But so there are all these things that support the lack of black and brown people in architecture that are based on history and systems. And so I have a session later today that I can go into more detail about that. But I think it's really important that we consider among that, I guess I'll add to that, the longevity of what we do as architects and designers, right? We don't design buildings that last 10 years, or at least I hope we don't design buildings that last 10 years. But the buildings that we design can last 100 plus years, 150 years. And so we're solidifying things in urban or rural fabric that should last longer than we are alive. And so for that reason, it's important that we consider the greater context as it relates to race, in regards to your question.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm just kind of curious. It's against that kind of backdrop that HBCUs play such a significant role. Historically, they were actually established as Black-serving institutions and historically focused on a low-income demographic, and much of that has actually changed. But HBCUs enroll 1 out of every 3 architectural students of color, and they face a set of unique challenges. Andrew, can you talk to what those challenges are more broadly and give all of us a sense as to how they further impact the School of Architecture?
Sure. So HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. People also use the acronym HSI, Hispanic Serving Institutions, like FIU. People use PWI, predominantly white institutions, majority big box schools. So 2 points I'd like to make. One, 30% of all registered Black architects are graduates of HBCUs. 30%. 30% of all Black architects come from 7 schools. 100 plus accredited architectural programs, 7 produce 30%. Okay. The other point, though, is 25% of the students at HBCUs are not Black. 25%, right? So the assumption is it's all Black kids at HBCUs. Mm-hmm. It's not. Visit FAMU, visit Morgan State. They're very different places, not what people expect. 25%, 30%. So if you want to make a change, if people want to make a change in the number of Black graduates, maybe you should invest in or plant your seed in certain places. I'll leave it at that. They're the same, but they're different, right? Whether you are old gray hair like me who went to school 100 years ago at a PWI or a young star at a HBCU, studio's the center of your universe. Faculty tear up your stuff. You got to do stuff over. You're up late at night. You're trying to get a job. You want to change the world and be a star. And I guess years ago, be on a magazine, right? But today, I guess it's a blog. But all that's the same. Being a student, being a young intern at work this morning at 6 a.m., it's all the same. Okay. The institutions, though, start to vary often based on scale. Right? HBCUs. FAMU's got 10,000 students, and it's the big one. It's the number 1 HBCU, the big boy on the block. 10,000 isn't that big compared to other universities it's competing with to be in the top 100. The other, though, big difference is kind of economics. More than 80% of the students at a HBCU, and let's go FAMU, public school, are on Pell Grant. Okay? At UF, FI, it's like 20%. Kids are just not on financial aid. Right? Most of the people we're in the same situation as me. You go to school and the faculty tells you, hey, by the way, we need to be in Atlanta in 3 days for a site visit. So, hey, you call mom and dad. Well, back in the day, mom and dad with money in your account. Now they use Cash App, right? You call mom and dad,
Venmo.
you go, you're expected to be there. But at a place where 80% of the kids are on financial aid, you can't just say, be there in 2 days. They got work, they got jobs, they got other responsibilities. So I think academically, the content is the same. It needs to be for accreditation reasons and our professional responsibility. The goals of the students are the same at a HBCU, at FAMU, at UVA, at UF. The goals of the students are the same, to change the world. But the institutions and some of what they have to deal with, like the financial condition of many of their students, varies greatly, and the endowments. You know, I read a statistic that said University of Minnesota's endowment equals the top 100 HBCUs. And the 100 HBCUs endowment equals one PWI.
Well, it was interesting because we had an earlier conversation in which we talked about how HBCUs uniquely support their students. And we had a conversation about FAMULE. And I didn't feel like family, by the way. I just want you to know. I want my t-shirt. Okay. So why don't you share with us just a little bit along those lines, because that is a unique challenge that HBCUs are addressing.
I would say it's assumed, it's expected, if you're teaching at an HBCU or if you're a student at HBCU, that it's student-centered. You know, years ago, the line was look to your left, look to your right. One of them ain't gonna be here, right? You gotta weed them jokers out. Only so many can make it, so many getting in the third year. My attitude, when Dean Wright has all our students pulled together, my attitude is look to your left, look to your right. Carry the person on your left, carry the person on your right. Don't leave anyone behind. You're one community, you're one family. Okay? You're not in competition with each other. You do your best. Okay? You're in this together. Because when they get a job, that's what the employers want. They want a team. They want someone who's going to operate as a team, not cut their other person off. I mean, we're here. It's assumed, it's expected, right? So it's assumed that, hey, are you okay? That's the first thing. Hey, you okay? How's work? You okay?
Yeah.
It's just a different atmosphere, and that atmosphere is expected.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
So I think that's really interesting. As one who did not attend an HBCU,
I didn't.
And has more limited experiences. One thing I hear from HBCU grads, either students that I've mentored or friends that I have that are about the same age, is a level of support and the expectation of success. Right? There's a whole different level of. So as a student at the University of Virginia, I could and did go throughout an architectural education with little to no identification of Black or brown. I guess if we count Zaha Hadid, then we can say brown, but with little to no recognition that Black and brown architects existed, because that was the environment at the University of Virginia. I was one of two a given graduation year, or three, excuse me. A given graduation year, and the focus was so strictly on design fundamentals that the Who, outside of Le Corbusier and other notable architects, was of less importance. And I think one thing that happens at an HBCU is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that there's this application, or actually I should say, Regine, you correct me if I'm wrong, but that there's this application of tough love and high standards, but it's understanding that the world outside of the HBCU is going to look different and
function different. Right,
and I want to make sure that you're successful. I've been in your place before, or a similar place before, which there are a lot of things that could not be said at the University of Virginia or Regent or Georgetown or any of the other schools that I attended. So,
but Regine, I want to hear your perspective. You had a choice as to where you chose to go to architectural school, and you chose to go to an HBCU. So talk a little bit about how that benefited you and how that weighed into your decision in terms of where you chose to go.
Okay, so when I applied for colleges. I applied for FIU, FAMU, and UCF. I went to all the open houses, and FAMU was one of the few that really made me feel like it was a family. Like they like to say it like, oh, it's a play on words, but I remember feeling like this is the place for me. Like it's, regardless of the size, like I never cared for like a large school, but School of Architecture definitely was like, we're here for you. We're trying to make sure that you are catered to and that you graduate and that you're not graduating alone. So I really appreciated that aspect. Aside from, oh, it's an HBCU, so it's full of Black people. I really liked the fact that we had a faculty that genuinely cared. And we have faculty that have been there for years, have seen many people become successful, and they know it's possible if you just have the right resources. And they made it clear that they will give you the resources to be successful. And I can attest to it now. Chen has definitely been in my my corner every chance. I have a roommate who's also in architecture, and me and her, we work together all the time. Like I've never felt in competition with any of the people that I'm in school with. And that's what I know that's what it's like in the real world. Like you want to be working collaboratively, but it's dog-eat-dog world. You want to make sure that you come out on top. But I learned, especially with FAMU, like it's very important to think about who's helped you be where you are, and make sure you get back to institutions like that. So, and I really respected that. So I decided to pick FAMU for that reason.
Now, we also had another conversation kind of piggybacking on that, that HBCUs provide a sense of what's clinically called psychological safety, that broadly does not exist within business. So Ken, why don't you talk a little bit about psychological safety, what it does in terms of supporting an individual? Because I think that kind of gives context, if you will, to what the experiences are of students.
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, people exist through the world and do the best they can. They try to be good to one another, generally speaking. I guess if we take out parts of history, but I'm talking modern day. And so if you are, I'll speak about a Black experience because that's the experience that I know. But if you're a Black person in America, then you encounter numerous microaggressions, things that are racism. They call them microaggressions because they tend to be pretty small. I don't always like that term, but
can you give an example of what?
So one that I used to get all the time. I used to get this in high school all the time. Kendall, you are so articulate.
Oh yeah, you speak so well.
Yeah, and that
Excuse me.
And so on the surface is a compliment, and I always took it as a compliment until I was about 20 or so, and people are still saying, oh, you speak so well, or you're so articulate. So let me back up a little bit. So there are things that are overtly racist or unjust. So we can think like lynching, right? That's something that is overtly wrong and racist, and most people in America would say not okay. But there are things that happen on a daily basis. Like I'm a big time runner. I like to run. And oftentimes I'm running down the street and people cross the street. It's like a thing that they do if they see me kind of coming, or they kind of turn their head like they don't want to make eye contact. Or like I said, the example, you're so articulate. A number of things that if you made a big deal about, somebody might kind of say, well, are you sure? It's kind of crazy, Yeah. I'll think of some more examples, but they're small. They're generally speaking small things. The writer, author of So You Want to Talk About Race, Ijeoma Oluo, she talks about microaggressions and compares them to a punch in the arm. And so every day, if you're a person of color, someone that is raced and red as a Black person, or a Latinx person, or a Middle Eastern person, or an indigenous person, that you encounter all these little punches. So every day you get a little punch. Somebody walks by and they don't smile or don't say anything, or you address someone. I had someone come in my house in Virginia to fix the dishwasher, and I asked him, how was he? And he said nothing. And I said, I'm sorry, how's your day going? And again, he said nothing. And he went straight to this dishwasher and started working. And I'm like standing there like, now I have somebody in my house.
Ignoring me.
Yes, like that just is kind of crazy to me. But I kept my composure and I thought, I guess I'll let him fix the dishwasher, because if not, I got to reschedule it. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing. So these microaggressions come and they're a small punch on the arm. Well, if you were to get punched into the same arm every day, let's say just twice a day, it could be at any point in the day, somebody's just going to come and punch you in the arm. Eventually, you'll get a bruise, right? And so you'll have one random day where someone will say something to you. Can I touch your hair? Or is that hair yours? Or something of that nature, where you'll go off because your arm is sore. You've been punched every day, twice a day. You don't know when it's coming. And finally, somebody punches you again and you say, like, I'm over it. I don't want to be punched anymore. And then everybody kind of looks at you like, oh, well,
Yeah.
It was just a small thing. Well, you have to consider the greater context of that. So anyway, to get back to your question about psychological safety, HBCUs, I think, do a better job at providing spaces where you're not having to encounter microaggressions all day, every day, because the way in which people of the same culture speak to one another is different.
The level of engagement.
Right, and so if the same could be said at an HSI, a Hispanic serving institution. If you have large numbers of Hispanic students and slightly more than normal Hispanic faculty, then the engagement that happens will be different.
So the other thing that I just want to add to that, along
Sorry
the
for that
lines
long.
of psychological safety that HBCUs provide, is it's so important because this also happens in practice. And we were talking about this. The practice is built on critique. It's built on judgment. That's the whole purpose of architecture. We're going to judge, we're going to criticize, we're going to problem solve, and we're going to get to a solution. And we teach you that over 5 years or so. And then on the year 6, we say, stop doing that. We want you to listen and acknowledge and validate. And so there's this disconnect that happens. Part of psychological safety is acknowledging the other person's lived experience, not judging, not criticizing, but validating. And I think HBCUs play such a unique role in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of schools have design centers. A lot of schools, you used to call them design centers, right? But I think one thing I do notice when you visit certain schools for accreditation visits, when all schools every 7-8 years, and you start to talk to them about how much they validate or how much are they involved in service, how much are they involved in their community. Is it a community design center and there are 3 people over here, or at one school there's 1 studio of the 7 studios and this 1 studio does the outreach thing? Or is it something that occurs across and is in the system, is in the institution that, wait, you have a responsibility of service. You have a responsibility where you need to go to places where you are not the expert and you're there to serve someone else and help them make their dream happen. And I think often at these minority serving institutions, there's an expectation, there's an understanding that is valued at a different level, that you have a responsibility. Yes, you have a responsibility to the discipline and create new text and go out and do lectures, but what change are you making to the place that you're in? And that place is that community, that region, that portion of the state. So at our school, it's about our design service and reaching out to the small towns in North Florida, whether it's Port St. Joe, Apalachicola, Dunellen, and these Inglis, where we've done Panacea, little things where people are not going to turn to architects often. They're going to get their drawings from some civil engineer, right? They just need permit drawings.
Right.
They don't want to pay for architecture. I just need drawings.
Yeah.
Right. So I think at our school and others, there's a respect for that. There's an appreciation for that to serve.
So we have focused over the last, I want to say, year or so as an industry on the grade school to college pipeline. I know we've had a lot of conversation around that. And a real focus has been placed on admissions. And I know we talked about this, and the sequence is usually acceptance, admission, retention, and graduation. But we tend to lose students of color, not necessarily at acceptance, but at retention. What are the challenges that architectural students face uniquely there? Or are they unique? And how can we help? How can the profession support in the area of retention?
Should we finish with Regine, the student outcome? I think the issue of is not just as a student, but even as a young intern. Mm-hmm. I think that if you say, so no one in my family was an architect. I was that kid who just liked to draw, and it's like, well, I don't want you to be an art major, go be an architect. I'm like, yeah, okay, Dad, whatever you say. As long as you're paying for school, I don't care.
Right.
I didn't know anyone was an architect, and like my class was like Kendall's. I was in a bumper crop, 4 black kids out of like 200 at UF at that time. Mm-hmm. 4 black kids in the school. Oh my gosh! And you looked around, you knew no one was like you. I mean, I couldn't get an internship for I never worked till I graduated.
Yeah.
I didn't know anybody, and I would work for free. I almost couldn't. Thank God for RTKL and certain other Todd Tragat and other people that gave me a shot. But you're by yourself, and I think that's one of the differences. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm wandering away from your question. But the same thing happens as you become an intern. I think the key is going to be getting a mentor and getting someone that you can connect with and have open conversations with. And regardless of that person's race, color, or gender, but it's finding those interns, those people that are going to help you get to where you need to be. And some people have those built-in connections, and some don't. Mm-hmm. I think that's, for me, that was part of how my experience was different. Just fighting to find out who can I connect with and build on, other than the other people in my class. But
that makes it hard, though, because my observation is that architecture as a profession is somewhat nepotistic.
Yeah.
So if you came from architecture, it's easy to make that connection. But that's not necessarily true for Latinx students or Black students. And so the onus is sometimes disproportionately placed on the student to try and find that connection.
Yeah, so I'm surprised when people tell me they're surprised the effort we go to for a career fair. And I'm like, yeah, we got to, because our students want jobs, right? They want a job and move on to the next big thing and live happily ever after.
Just like everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of a school's responsibility to help you go on to your thing versus just, okay, here's your degree, go. Let's move on to the next one. I don't know what UVA's experience or Regine could talk about hers.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes, I think FAMU, Special School of Architecture, does a phenomenal job at trying to make sure we have a job and we have someone that we can talk to. And if it's not, it's going to be someone like Chen or a faculty member checking in on us and making sure, hey, how's your internship going? They've put me in contact with so many people that I didn't even know about. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you, I work at Robert Stern, didn't hear about them until this year. And I'm working with them, and it's phenomenal, and I'm having a great time. And I have people who interviewed me, they still reach out to me. I have Chen who talks to me every once in a while, like, hey, how's it going? My roommate's working for Gensler, same situation, where they had mentors that come into the classroom from the company, and then they continue checking in on them. And I think something like that's really important, because it makes me feel like, one, I'm not alone. Like, I know I'm not the only architect intern in the world, but it feels like sometimes it's hard. It's really hard. And having people who understand that, like, it's difficult. I woke up today at 6 a.m. after coming into Orlando at 1 a.m. to try to get some work done before I came here. So I feel like that's a very specific niche understanding that only people who are familiar with the architecture career path is familiar with. So I think the fact that we have someone pretty much to hold our hand, and they encourage, like, joining organizations, Alpha Chi, AAS, NOMAs, to join that, so that you're in contact with alumni who have done it before you. And so you know you're not alone, because look where these people are, and they're successful and they're happy.
Yeah, I think another piece, I'll just say really quickly, is the idea that architecture does not and I'm saying architecture with a capital A, doesn't necessarily recognize the difference as a positive, the difference of people as a positive moniker, I guess. So I'm thinking, especially as it relates to retention, there are oftentimes a lot of students, specifically students of color, start in architecture, and then they leave after the first or second year and go to urban planning because they realize that urban planning has a theme of taking care, urban and regional planning, of taking care of Black and brown communities in a way that architecture doesn't. And so to be a Black person in architecture, you have to cross so many T's and dot so many I's and work, because the discipline is somewhat elitist, you have to work towards that elitism and be so articulate and be so many different things that pull you away from your culture of origin or general identity, then to graduate and then serve and not be able to serve the people that you came from.
Right.
And so that's a really complicated mix, and you have to, it's just a complicated thing to be able to work really hard, be at the top, get through design school and the long hours, and then graduate and think, who am I going to serve?
Yeah.
It's not going to be people like me.
That look like me.
So then what is my value on a team? I mean, all of these are things like your question about psychological safety that you have to try to consider in the grand scheme of things.
And tomorrow, I know in your session, you're going to be talking specifically about the question, who do we serve?
Yeah, and this later today.
Later today. So I hope everybody has an opportunity to go by and kind of continue this conversation. Thinking back, Regine, to before you went to architecture school, how prepared do you feel you were? You have a unique situation, so why don't you share that with everybody about how prepared you were to enter architecture school? And then, Andrew, I'd like you to speak to, is that normal? Is that everyone's lived experience?
All right, so I went to Tampa Bay Technical High School in Tampa, Florida. It's a magnet school, and they have the option to study architecture. So when I went into architecture school, I had a working knowledge of CAD, Revit. I was just starting Revit, and then I remember, I was like, yeah, I know I'm gonna be the best. And then I remember—
This is out of high school.
This is out of high school.
Okay.
I'm thinking I'm on top of the world. And I had spoken to maybe an urban planner, the city urban planner for Hillsborough County, and I wasn't quite in love with it just yet. But so when I went, I thought I was there. And then I got a reality check, because the first year of architecture school, you do not touch the computer, you draw. And I remember thinking, I used to volunteer a lot at the UACDC, and I met the architect, and I remember I really I want to work for the people. I want to make community centers. I want to make a more safe place for neighbors so that people can thrive like me. If I didn't volunteer, if I wasn't in this space, I would not know what I wanted to do with my life. And so I went to architecture, I continued, and meeting people who were also interested in what I was interested in, and helping. It wasn't just, I want to make a house for somebody. I was very thankful for the fact that I have like-minded people around me. And so with how FAMU or my past prepared me for FAMU, one, I'd like to say I was a little bit ahead of the curve when it came to using the computers, because there's people who I learned in college are computer illiterate, and they were not literate until they got into the classes necessary, so they were behind. And I kind of make it a point now to if I see people or my classmates are not as familiar as I am or as I can be, I make sure to help them. And I feel like that's another family moment. Yeah.
Now that's unique,
Yeah.
because I think we spoke.
Oh,
Andrew.
yeah. 9 out of 9 innings. I didn't know what architects do. I just like drawing what was in comic books and da-da-da-da and art class. And I grew up, so it was very different than Regine. It's interesting, all three of us had very different academic foundations, different kinds of places. But I grew up so it's interesting. I did not, in terms of preparation for architecture school, I had zero prep for the tech I had all the prep for the social, all the non-tech. I was used to being the only black kid in the class. I grew up in the suburbs in New York. Being in a predominantly white environment was the norm. And when that's the norm, architecture school doesn't surprise you, like Kendall would say. It's like, okay, I'm used to this. I'm just going to do what I got to do, keep my head down, plow. And when I shine, I tell my kid, when you shine, it's your superpower. They're going to remember that black kid with the Chinese name and get an A, and they know you. So I think that it's important on one hand for the kids my attitude is the kids will learn the tech when they graduate, but we have to prepare them for all of the soft skills, if you want to call it, all of the teamwork, all of learning to get up at 6 a.m. and grind and get the work done. They'll learn the software and the tech, but it's about operating in kind of this AIA environment, realizing you need to build your network of people, being comfortable around other people. So mine was very different, but I think at least among us, it shows that regardless of someone's foundation or academic plan, a public big box school, a big HBCU, or a private school in Virginia, the individuals are very much like all the other individuals in architecture, come in all flavors. It's just about kind of work ethic, grind, and
Kendall, your experience was different still, because Regine started out like at a tech magnet school. Andrew was in the public school, none, and yours was?
Yeah, so I went to a school that was predominantly white, and so had a similar experience to Andrew in that, and being in a predominantly white, gifted and talented or high academically centered high school with just a little bit of experience of architecture. I did, however, have the privilege of interning for an architect the summer before I left for the University of Virginia. And so I got there to UVA, and UVA, in the grand scale of schools, there are 140. I work for the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, so there are approximately 140 architecture schools that are accredited in the US. And they range from being technical-based to computer-based to very theoretical, and UVA is more on the theoretical side. So I had a little bit of firm experience, and I did want to do houses. I'm like, I just want to do houses. Like, just teach me how to do beautiful houses. And I got there, and they were like, no. And so I was like, okay. But as it relates to theory, Architecture 101, I sat down in a class with a really interesting professor, and they handed me 5 index cards, a pistachio seed, and I think a pencil. And they talked about how we were going to diagram the lawn, Jefferson's Academical Village. And I just felt like, where am I? And why? Like, what are we doing here? But that being said, it was still an uphill climb, because for me at the University of Virginia, I was with all of the other Virginia kids that were at the top of their class and trying to figure it out. So yeah, I think to your point, it really takes some curation to get from beginning to end.
So you have 3 people on the stage, myself included. I went to a PWI as well, predominantly white institution. And the experiences are very, very different. Regine's is different than yours, Ken, and different than yours, Andrew, and certainly very different than mine. But yet and still, we tend in the practice of architecture to treat all Black people, all AAPI, all Latinx as a monolith. Can you talk a little bit, Kendall, about what that does to identity in particular?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting sometimes, because the numbers are so few, that the students of color get treated as the students of color, the students that require something different. But even within the racial constructs, there are multiple facets that would differentiate people. So for instance, and like I said, I work for ACSA, so I'm looking at statistics all the time of who's at what school and what's the proportion of, let's say, Black students to Latinx students at a given school. So for instance, if we're sitting, let's say I'm sitting in a 100-person class, there are 2 Black students. There's me, who identifies as African American, and then there's another Black student that, or let's say whose parents immigrated from Nigeria. Like the difference between us on paper, the school would be able to say we have 2 Black students, so 2% of our 100 students are Black. But on paper, the way in which our identity manifests, what might offend us, what might not offend us, underlying ideas are going to be drastically different because he has, in this case, this is an imaginary person, but he has the context of Africa and Nigeria specifically to use as a foundation, to use as a precedent. Whereas I have a history of enslavement and understanding of, in this case, Virginia, to use as a precedent. And then furthermore, if we just take that specific example, we have a differentiator of, what's the best way to say it? A differentiator of I'll say this. We have a different set of foundational knowledge that will affect our design, right? I sat in a number of studio classes where the program was a center for cycling, a museum, a dance studio, things that are great didactic tools, but never did I sit in a class where an African-American church was the program. And imagine how different it would have been for me as a student to have that as a precedence in my head to be able to work from. And so as a student, in regards to my identity, which is multifaceted, it's cisgender, male, heterosexual, Christian, Black, I could go through a long list, able-bodied. I was always sitting at a table where I couldn't always use a background. Like I didn't always have a background. Imagine one of the things that my wife and I decided to do was to foster kids. And so we foster children personally and have adopted children. But imagine, I'm pulling that in because a lot of the times we live in Virginia, not that far from the coast, and kids have not seen the beach. And so imagine if you've never been to the beach, how you would design anything that interacts with the beach. You wouldn't have the precedence to do. I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on.
So still the importance, though, is to acknowledge that while individuals may come from the same race, they do not necessarily have the same lived experience.
That hit me. I was years ago. I remember looking out a window, and it was in a copy room, and there was a young woman next to me, and we were in a copy room looking out a window, and in this architecture school I was working at, looked out on a parking lot, and the student said, "Oh gosh, I forgot this in my car." And I'm like, "Okay, you're parked out," and she's like, "Yeah, I'm parked over there," and I'm like, "Okay, why don't you just go get it?" And she looked out the window at the parking lot. She goes, "It's not safe." And it was like 10, 11 o'clock at night. And I said, "What are you talking about? The lights are on, And her answer was, "No, it's not safe. I can't go out there in my car and get it. It's not safe." And it hit me. I'm like, oh my gosh. And, I'm a guy, hood, and I'm not 6'4", whatever. But I'm a guy, and I look out at a parking lot, and I see lights are on. It's safe. I'm going to go get my stuff.
Yeah. But her lived experience is something different.
Exactly. And I can't sit there and say, what you're wrong. No, you're right. I'm right. Yeah. We're both right.
Yeah.
But that's one moment that hit me that I kind of realized, wow, her experience, she sees everything different than me. I just need to be aware of that. And for me, it was a gender. It wasn't even about, I think she was white, female. It wasn't about black and white. It was about male. I think about it always as male, female. And it's like, she just sees things, spaces. And then it made me roll into, wow, we're here in an architecture building talking about making spaces, and I'm critiquing her design work, her spaces, but she doesn't see spaces the same as me.
that you do.
We see them differently.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there saying, oh my gosh. So maybe how much of what I have critiqued has really bounced and hits this shield of, I'm just like, oh. So for me, that's one way I always remember that.
So what she basically signaled to you was that parking lot's not
That's what
safe.
she said. It's not safe.
And that perspective was based on her having some experience in her life.
In her life, or what she's been told, what she's seen, or what exactly experienced. And it may not have been her personal action. It may have been what she has been taught,
Right.
what she has been told. But it's what she knows. And it's just as right as my thought that, hey, it's safe out there. It's just a parking lot. Lights are on.
Kendall will be
Yeah,
next
so
time.
what she's been told by people she trusts, right? Like
Right.
that relationship piece is really important. I heard you say, Karen, the piece about signaling, right? Like there were different signals to her, and I want to pick up on that. That's something we talked about, previously. But that, generally speaking, Black and brown people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color operate by going through the world looking for signals, trying to find the signals that indicate belonging and safety. And the same could be said of other marginalized groups, right? So you just talked about the difference between men and women and how women are looking for signals for belonging and safety. And so those signals can come through websites, it can come through photos, it can come through food that's at a specific event. I can tell you if I go somewhere, like if the event, let's say there's a lunch later, and if the lunch has food that is specific to my upbringing, then I'm going to be like, oh, look, here's that. I'm supposed to be here because the food is the food that my mom would make, right? And that's really different than if we were having fancy hors d'oeuvres or something like that. But I think that's an important piece to also think about. I mean, if we apply it directly to every day, then think about your individual practices and how are your firms signaling to people of color in the context of race, to people of color that they're welcome, or that not only that they're welcome, but that they belong. Yeah.
And it's people of color, people of different gender, people of different sexual orientation.
Right.
Do you even ask yourself, am I doing things that signal to others they don't belong? At
So
least ask yourself.
I wanted Regine to give her perspective too, because we talked about this. You're now at Robert M. Stern.
Yes.
Give me your perspective, give all of us your perspective around what you have experienced relative to this idea of signaling.
Okay, so I remember looking at Robert Stern Architects, the website, and going, this is wealth. Almost everything, it just screamed wealthy. And I definitely am more interested in doing like public institutions. So when I see architecture that screams wealth, this hotel to be specific as well, I can just think about how the fact that less than 100 years ago, I probably would not be allowed. I don't want to say 50, 60, probably would not be allowed to. Or if I was, I would be looked at very differently. Well, everybody on the stage would be looked at like, why are you here? And lots of architecture is reminiscent of, well, it's not for you. This architecture is not for you. You're not supposed to be here. I think of shotgun houses. I'm okay with them. I can be in them just fine. Certain institutions, I'm okay with. I'm okay with, but I know that I'm not going to feel uncomfortable in a specific space. I'm in the School of Architecture at FAMU. Even though it's just because it's an HBCU doesn't mean I'm going to be comfortable 100% of the time. But there's a lot of familiarities that make me feel like, yes, I'm here in a safe space. I'm in a space that I was invited, I'm allowed, I don't have to feel out of place. And there's a lot of other buildings on other campuses, other institutions, community centers, like where you feel like, yes, I'm supposed to be here. And it's okay that I'm here. I'm not offending anybody. So
I'm welcome.
I'm welcome here.
Yeah, there are a lot of, there are architecture schools that only had men's rooms, right? and what did that say about who belongs? You know, I'm very conscious of the marketing materials we put out as HBCU to say if we're open to everyone, we need to think about who do we put in these images? You know, because who you put in the images, that's who you want. And are you quickly telling someone we don't want you here?
It's always interesting to me when I look at college and university marketing material. My children are, well, my son is now 20 and my daughter is 16, and I will go to college open houses and they'll talk about, oh, we want diverse and inclusive student bodies, and then they hand me the material and I go through it, and it's like there's no diverse faculty. And there are very few pictures of diverse students. And so when I turn to my daughter or my son and say, do you feel like you belong here? The answer is no. And they have gone to predominantly white institutions, but they're looking at it because a signal is saying, this is not necessarily a place for me. You're saying one thing, but you're doing something else. Yeah. So I'm curious, kind of fast forward to where we are today. We talk a lot about community design. But architecture historically has really been founded on the ideas that reinforce separatism. So as we think about community design and inclusion, how do we achieve more inclusion at this point in time in the profession when flags and monuments and other things continue to reinforce you don't belong? How do we cross that chasm?
Inclusion in terms of increasing
Design.
inclusion in terms of ideas and attitude, and then it's different than inclusion in terms of demographics and composition. Right? There's two different.
There's two different aspects of it.
I think so. I think about one at our school. I said to someone recently, I said, well, why don't we ask the AIA if they would write support and we could do an equivalent of, as she put it, ArchCore, almost like a design core, and provide architectural services for free when architects don't want to provide it. And we know certain people are going to go to some civil engineer and just get a set of drawings. But for people who often don't even know, how are we going to serve them? How are we, and to me, how you serve other people is a very different mindset than what schools do. In that I got to give her grade and him his grade. So you do your work and don't help that person. You do your work. I want to give you credit.
Right.
And I need to know what you don't know. Because I need to grade you on what you know. So let's put up some walls. You do your work. What's your ideas? What do you think? How did you solve this problem? To me, that's kind of the problem we create. Versus, I know if we're sending students to, I don't want to keep naming a certain office, Ignacio, our friends at Gensler or Rhodes and Brito, HOK or Gresham, they want students that'll work with other people. They want graduates that get along in a team. So I think about that. But you say the comment about the statues and comments. I got a 12-year-old kid, and he asked me the other day, what does it mean? Hey, Dad, what does it mean when I see these trucks with the cross flag? I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, there's this truck. Should I worry about those trucks? And I'm sitting there saying, oh my God. He sees these Confederate flags on these pickup trucks. And to me, it's almost like a mobile statue. And even a little kids pick up signals and signs. And I was like,
and then those signals roll into practice and
so
society.
It's like, what is it that other people see? So you have to, after a while, you realize for some people it's the norm. I mean, some people, like when you talked about, Kendall was hesitant about saying lynching is bad, but some people see some things as okay, no problem with it, and others see it as, as oh my gosh, how dare you do that thing? So, I think it's the notion of being inclusive, of community design is about recognizing and respecting the expertise of others versus I'm the expert and I'm going to tell you what you need.
I want to do a time check because there's no time down here. Because I do want to allow people the opportunity to ask questions. I'm not exactly sure how much time I have left. But I think what I'd like to try and do is see if there are questions. I do have a couple final questions, but I do want to allow time. So does anyone have any questions?
I've got one question right here. What are the suggestions on attracting diversity to areas where there is a challenge? So we have a member from Northwest Florida that's asking, how do you attract diverse applicants for architecture firms in an area like Northwest Florida that doesn't have a diversity support system?
So it's interesting. So I think that all schools, regardless of where they are and where they are, need to recognize that when the students graduate, are you preparing them to operate in a more diverse space? So at a school that is HSI or HBCU, do you have a diverse student body? Are you getting students of even your demographic of very different backgrounds? That black kid from Africa is not like that black kid from Ocala, Tampa, or Micanopy. And then how are you getting non-other students in the population, let's say state college transfers? But even of those places, they all have career fairs. So, everyone's got to decide, they all have career fairs. And whether it's at Auburn or Tuskegee or at FAMU, all have career fairs. And other firms are there, a certain person who got with a certain firm, it's because it was a career fair. And I'll tell you, Gensler, HOK, Rhodes and Brito, Jacobs, Gresham, Leo Daly, they're all of our advisory board. Everyone's there because they're there to get talent. You can't wait for the talent to show up at your doorstep. You're gonna have to go get it.
Oh, can I jump in? I feel like visibility of architecture or architects need to be increased as well when it comes to picking a career field when you're young. Like, this is a cool building, but you don't know who does it. Like, you don't know, you just know what the building is. I feel like as architects, we tend to hide behind the building, but you don't know the person who it is. And I feel like when schools bring in or architects from firms, like, it kind of brings them to a more human level. Like, hey, like, this is a person just like you. Like, I feel like going out to the communities and saying, like, this is an option, this is a career field, and this is a major at my college, please come. I feel like it makes students more likely to pick something other than, I don't want to say the generic school majors.
I would add to that, though, but go ahead, Kendall.
I was just going to say really quickly, it's 11:05, so we're good.
Thank you. Thank you. I love you.
But also, I think if you can't show the people, you can show your work, right? Like, is your work going to help the communities that are in need where you are? Because if your work isn't serving the people and you don't have any people, then I think it's going to be really a hard challenge to get people to come to you.
I think the other part to that, though, is even if you don't have a diverse body, it is important to be clear that your perspective is wanted. I think I sit on the board of an engineering company, and one of their offices, it's just absolutely not possible for them to have diversity. They're in, I think it's Seattle or Portland. And we've talked at great length about what it means to have inclusive perspective. And that really has to be the driver, from my perspective, Ignacio, is allowing other voices at the table, regardless of what those voices look like.
There was one question here and then on the side, but there was someone had their hand up.
Okay, you'll have to scream, sorry.
Okay, hi, my name is Shania. I'm actually from Panama, so I guess I'm considered a Latina. Things I didn't have to think about back in Panama, but being here, I couldn't think about. And so my question is how do you balance that? Because I don't want to be, I don't even know what I'm asking, but if I'm doing a good job, I don't want to be recognized because I'm leading a spectrum or a percentage of Latina. I want to be recognized because I'm a good architect. Well, I'm not an architect yet, but you know what I'm saying. I want to be recognized by my accomplishments, not because I mean a percentage, or an end of the spectrum. So how do I don't want people to be tiptoeing around me because I'm not this, I'm not speaker. I want people to treat me normal, not normal, not because I'm not them or Hispanic. So what's the balance? how does it not?
Kendall.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
So I did a piece, Karen referenced the piece I did, Where Are My People Black in Architecture? I did a piece, Where Are My People Latinx in Architecture? And that was one of the common themes I asked people, people who identified as Latinx or Hispanic, about what obstacles they faced. One question in particular was, when did you realize your identity as a person of color? And a lot of people remarked that they didn't realize it until they came to the US, right? Because where they may have migrated from, they could have been in the majority, or it was there wasn't a necessary differentiator. And so to your question, I think I say this about race and race-related things all the time, it's complicated and it's complex. So yes, you want to be able to highlight your work, but the reality is, at least in an American context, is that people read and race people as like one of the first things that they do. Like if I enter a room, right? Yeah, and even more so. There's an article by Peggy McIntosh called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's about white privilege largely, but there's this attachment to class. It's like classifying people, really, for lack of better words. And so I think being at a place that values you as a Latina will actually serve you better than a place that does not see you as a Latina at all. Because the place that doesn't see you as a Latina is still gonna hear your accent when you speak, and is still gonna be curious about some cultural norms that you actually don't want. You just want somebody to be like, here's, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but here she is, and she's one of our great designers. And it will be because they've already, like, they're past the checking the box thing. Like, here's one of our designers, and she's great. And if you run into a situation, I'm making this longer than it needs to be, but if you run into a situation where someone is treating you differently because you are a Latina, then they will have your back. And you won't, so you don't have to have your own back. And I'll talk about that later in the session.
The only thing I would add to that really is make sure you find a firm that is a cultural fit for you. When you find a firm that is the right fit culturally, you can show up and be your authentic self. And it's not about checking a box. But if the firm that you go to, for whatever reason, they offered me the most money or whatever, really is not a cultural fit for your ideas, for your values, for thought leadership, then it's a disconnect. And you will forever be seen, to Kendall's point, as checking a box. Somebody else had a question.
There was one far right and then one in the middle.
I can't see because that light's on my face.
Used to picking out
Yes,
students.
ma'am.
My name is Nadine Levy,
I know her.
from grad. I know that. I'm glad we're doing this panel. And I've had the perspective of a student, and I'm majority right school, and then practicing in a minority firm. Then even move on to my own, opening my own practice. I also had the privilege of practicing with two Black female architects when I was about her age as an intern, and that blew my mind. Because back then there were only 99 of them in the country. So that was like, it literally changed my perspective. One of the things that I'm speaking as a practitioner, one of the things that grieves me to say today is that 27 years ago, 27 27 years ago, when I was still in school, speaking to my architecture school director and asking, why don't we reach out? Why don't we do more diversity inclusion? Why don't we seek this? Why don't we do this? We were told, we are not looking for you. We're looking for second generation architects. In other words, that told us, we do not value your place. And it shocked us so much that in some terms it shut us down. Because when you are told, literally told, you do not matter, it changes your perspective on everything. And for some of you who have not lived life as a minority, you may not see what the big deal is. But for those of us, maybe the women in the room will understand this better, because even as, say, white women, the fact that you're women in a male-dominated society and business, when you are told you do not matter, it shifts something in you fundamentally. And so the concept that they're talking about here, and for so long, 27 years ago, our AIA in particular has been dealing with the concept of inclusion. Where do we go? We've been talking about this a long time. The question is, are we really ready for inclusion? Are we really ready to shift and do the uncomfortable work? Because it means investing ourselves, investing money. Like you said, do we just patronize the token people? Or do we respect them to respect their perspective? Do we respect them? Do you assign all the social projects to the people of color? Because they came from those neighborhoods, so you put them back in those neighborhoods. It sounds good, but maybe that's not what they want. Maybe they want it to be this architecture. I want to be the big designer. I want to be, maybe they don't want it. And I'm glad you talked about the diversity, right? But also look at practice. I started my own business because going back to the corporate, I knew I was educated. I had the drive, the intuition, the skill, everything, and I knew that going to corporate meant that I'm going to have to jockey for all these people who are second generation, who have friends as lawyers and doctors and engineers. And I'm just an immigrant from a little country back there with no social network, no value. So I said, I'll carve my own space. 12 years ago, I was able to carve that space. But it was extremely difficult. You know why? I showed up at AIA, at Principal Roundtable. I was the only pepper in the song. And when I showed up, everybody had their conversations. And nobody said, no, you're here. Come on over. What do you do? It's very trusting. If you're the only person every day, it's that minor impression that happens.
So you started your own, you started your own practice, but I think you raise a good point, which is, are we at a crossroads now to really do the hard work?
Yeah.
And what is your
I
collective?
mean, at least it's on the table.
At least it's on the table, right?
That's a step, and at least people are in a room. So
I think I've
we'll
had
see.
more difficult conversations, and not just because of the vodcast, but just in total. I think we've had more difficult conversations around the construct of race, and the construct of race and its intersection with architecture and design in the last 12 months than I've ever had in my entire 25-year career. So I do think that if there is a chance for a shift, this is probably the closest we've ever gotten to it.
There was another
But
question.
I did see, I thought I saw
Yeah.
another question.
So shift to your last question.
Okay.
Oh, one.
there's-
There was hello.
It's a very difficult subject to constantly hear conversations about, especially in a society where we have been gifted the ability to have an inclusion of cultures throughout the world. We make problems for ourselves because we're expecting, I think, that we're to be given things that normally a successive cultural emergence allows for by the persistent activity that one goes through and learning how to do something. We all do this, every culture, every society. Let's not forget how important it is for our society that has been gifted this democracy to move that ball forward. And let's not go back and degrade the history that we have at this point, because we have gained so much. I was a young kid back in the 70s when I started school, went to a very good university, struggled to get there. The labeling of me as a minority, I thought was a little bit unfair because I'm just a guy who speaks English in American society that's American, and I learned how to speak English because that's what I grew up learning. I was in a Spanish-speaking community that preferred to speak Spanish because their ethnicity wanted them to be Spanish ethnicity, speaking Spanish. Well, my parents didn't believe that we're in America, that we should be there, that we should learn how to speak the language of the culture. And that language of the culture here has set a precedent over centuries that have gifted us the ability to have a society that has diversity. Yet we constantly are bringing this down by not adapting ourselves to the requirements of that growth opportunity. And I don't know how to put it any better than saying that it's hard. But we can't make bones about it all the time, because it's not helpful. What we have to do is, let's forget all that chatter. And yes, your issues are fundamental. I understand that. When you come to a culture where your language skills aren't perfectly English, my wife complains to me all the time. You can't spell with a damn. Well, okay, I didn't study spelling. I studied math. I studied other things. I'm very good at math. I'm not good at spelling. My father didn't teach me Spanish when I grew up. I learned how to speak English because it was important. When I came to that public forum, your graceful ability to have the language skills, and they look and say, you have great language skills. That's a wonderful thing. And those language skills have propelled you to make your advancements further because you're in a society which has predominantly those language skills. Some people like spicy food. Some people like ham and grits. Some people like stew and beef, and some people like Indian food. Here in America, we have all of that. And every culture has a special interest in those special, unique characteristics that give their ethnicity a balance. But we are in a culture of multiple ethnicities. And we have to be able to, as we learn, you're going to be practicing, if you're going to practice architecture as a black architect, and you're going to do work for your blackness, that's fine. But that isn't the field of architecture. The field of architecture is generating buildings. Uses determine what your skills are going to be able to give you as an opportunity to express yourself. Are there a lot of uses out there that are affecting your need to fulfill your sense of blackness in architecture?
This is not a forum.
No. I expect what you're saying, but it is a forum for all of us as architects to understand that there's a place for inclusion for everybody. There's 100 white people here. They're not all exactly the same white person.
Yes.
There's a lot of ethnic people here. They're not all the same ethnicity. We're a diverse community, and let's all respect that. And yes, it is a forum. That's why we're here. That's why they're sitting up there, because it is a forum. And
So-
I
Yeah, it was interesting when I said to the young lady, I said, I'm getting old, right? Gray hair. It was interesting when I heard your comment, it made me think of a gentleman, Max Bond, an architect in New York, I heard him say a quote, no one ever said Jackie Robinson hit black home runs.
Right.
And I said, everyone wants to get to that point where I'm not doing black architecture, I'm not doing Latino architecture, I'm not doing feminine architecture. Yeah. I am an architect doing great design work, and I just happen to be that. And that reminded me of one thing. The other point is, you were speaking, kind of the assumptions. And I remember, so I grew up in New York. I went to school in Florida. And I'm in the dorm, and the people are like, hey, yeah, you're from New York? I go, yeah. And then they start saying, so you live in a blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, you watch too much TV.
You watch too much TV.
I got a front yard, backyard. I cut the grass. I cut the neighbor's grass for $20.
Yeah.
I deliver newspapers and da-da-da-da-da. And it was also always when I hear people, this assumption that this means you grew up in this black community, so you want to do black work. I'm like, no, I grew up, I went to more bar mitzvahs than, Kwanzaa parties.
Yeah, exactly.
I got, I had my yarmulke.
I just want to be treated equitably.
I'm like, hey, so it follows, what the gentleman said, and so I would always, so I find myself catching myself, and I think it isn't, I think it comes down to every office to think about what do they want to be, and then go out and get that, because the talent is out there, and I better defer to Jenna because she'll get mad at me.
Well, let me just I just want to say really quickly that I think the history and systems are extraordinarily important. Let's not negate. Let's not negate the history and systems as such. So if you come to my lecture later, I'll tell you, but I'll give you this preview. That I like to make the comparison between America in this context and my wife. My wife is white, and I don't think I can love my wife if I don't recognize her flaws, right? Like, she's not a perfect person, and everything is, I love her dearly, but she would also say the same of me. I'm not a perfect person. And so if we start to think that a genuine sense of love and acceptance is by ignoring faults, then I think we're in a really scary place.
Yeah.
And then, I had one more thing. I think the take from this was that you recognize that white people are not the same. And I think because everybody has different backgrounds. We just talked about all four of us have different backgrounds. We're not the same, but I think architecture tends to favor one. And again, white people are not the same. You did not grow up the same way. But you're in architecture with a different perspective. And what it is that Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people, we all want to be recognized for our perspective so that we can move forward, but we're not forgetting is not what's going to happen.
I'd like to ask one more question if possible. My name is Jenna. I'm an alumni under internship at Ross & Wright. And so now that I'm in a firm and in practice, we are having a lot of conversations in our office right now about culture and how important that is. And I think this actually has a lot, I think the conversation we're having now also, I think, relates directly back to the conversation we had this morning with the guest speaker that was just before this. You're talking about how important this sense of belonging is in our office culture. So I have colleagues of mine who are Black, who are designers and architects in my office. I want to have a conversation about how we can improve our inclusion in the culture of our office right now. How would you recommend I have that conversation? How do you initiate it? What are the questions you ask? How do you engage someone and say, I want to do something about the culture in our office, or I want to just check in and see what is the culture of our office?
I think that's where you start.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if you have advice about how we might start that conversation.
Just real quickly, I think you have to first acknowledge that you are trying to understand what the culture is of your office, and that culture may be viewed through the lens of different people differently. So kind of start, Gabrielle and I talk about this all the time, start by kind of doing a survey or a pulse of where people are in their experience of your firm culture, and then take a step back and say, okay, now what is the culture that I want to create? And where is the gap? So I think that's critically important to understand, because each person may experience very differently your organization than what you intend for it to be. Do you all have any closing thoughts? Because I have one final question real quick.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, is to be able to survey and start there, because those will be the facts that you can use. But we can talk more. We can talk more if you want.
So in our closing minute, because I know that's all I have, what specifically do you think our audience can do with their power, their privilege, their whiteness, their otherness, to shift the profession and foster different types of accessibility?
So I know we have 60 seconds. I'll keep it short. I'll just say really briefly, would be to interrupt bias, right? Like to be the person, to be the voice for someone who either doesn't have the voice or needs help with that voice, is to interrupt bias. And again, I'll talk more about it later.
I kind of second him with advocacy, advocate for the people who don't have the voice that you have, and also do more outreach, like reach out to the community that you're serving.
I mean, I would say 2 points. One, your office can develop either a long-term goal, or do you want to make the long-range plan or the short-term plan? Do you want change in 6 years or 6 months? Do you want to invest and spend time in changing the discipline through things like NOMA pipeline and change the pipeline in that manner? I know Orlando, NOMA is doing that, and with Miami, and it's online. I know there's BAM architecture, and some great people at MC Harry out of Miami are leading that effort. But there's also this ACE, architecture, construction, engineering, which is a mentorship program for high school students. There's a Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville. Those are all of those efforts to change the pipeline, to change the discipline. But then there's also, if you want to change in 2-3 months, go to a school and offer a third-year student internship. FAMU, Tuskegee, Auburn, all these schools, if it's HSI like FIU, they have career fairs. They're looking, and people come there looking for talent. It just happens to often be more diverse. If you want your office to stay the same, hey, go to the same places, get the same talent, the same kind of place. But if you just want talent, then maybe you go far and wide, because you want all the talent, not just the little talent at one place. And that's what most of the schools are looking for, places that are looking for talent. We are diverse, so we're here to serve you if your office wants to change.
Andrew, Kendall, Regine, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.